In this lesson, we'll normalize the clip's tonal range using the curves controls. First, I'll press Option F to toggle off the enhanced viewer. Then I'll double-click on one of the clip names to switch from the codec to the actual clip name, and select the third one, Kwai Waterspout. Then I'll press Option F to go back into the enhanced viewer. In the waveform, we can see a good distribution of values. However, there's very little on the bottom of the waveform. In other words, there's very little dark shadow area. The highlights look good, nothing's clipped, but we need to take care of expanding the tonal range, specifically in the lower area. Curves are another approach to grading a clip and can be used to adjust tonal range, color balance, and secondary color corrections. Here we'll use them to adjust tonal range. As opposed to the master wheels, in which each adjusts a set luminance range of either shadows, midtones, or highlights, curves provide greater control over adjusting contrast in specific luminance ranges. Much like the primaries palette, the curves palette in Resolve 18 replaced this pop-up menu at the top right with a row of icons, and the name of the selected curve type appears at the top left next to the curves palette name. Functionally, all curves are identical between Resolve 17 and 18. The curves palette includes a histogram overlay. A histogram displays information about the number of pixels at each luminance level, from the darkest at the left to the brightest at the right. It shows each color channel as well as the luminance values. The higher the curve, the more pixels in the image at that luminance value. For example, we can see here that there are almost no pixels to the left, in the darkest part of the histogram. This mirrors the lack of traces in the bottom of the waveform. By the way, you can expand the curves palette by clicking this button, and you can move it and resize it, just like the scopes palette. Both the histogram and the waveform are displaying luminance information in different ways. The waveform shows luminance values vertically instead of horizontally, and it shows where in the image horizontally the different brightness values can be found. In fact, if you considered every trace on the waveform to be a pixel, and you rotated the waveform clockwise 90 degrees, if the traces could then fall down stacked on top of each other, you'd get the histogram we see overlaid over the curves palette. For example, notice the very small number of traces at the very top of the waveform, about a third of the way from the left. These likely represent this bright part of the cloud a third of the way across the image, but could also be the white water along the same vertical stripe, or the reflection in the water. We see those same pixels represented in histogram at the far right, indicating that there are a small number of pixels in the image that are at the brightest level. You can adjust the histogram in the options menu. You can turn it off, select input values, or output values. The histogram is another analytical tool at your disposal, which provides information on both luminance and color balance, as we'll see. The default curve is the custom curve. It includes a white line from the bottom left to the top right, with control points at each end. The horizontal axis represents the luminance range of the clip, from the darkest at the left to the brightest at the right. The vertical axis represents the offset from the original starting luminance values. Currently, there's no offset with this straight line. By default, the luminance is ganged or coupled with the red, green, and blue color channel curves. By clicking this link icon, we can uncouple it and adjust the luminance curve by itself. By dragging the bottom left control point right across the floor, we can bring down the shadow areas. This is analogous to dragging left in the master wheel in the lift section of the color wheels, like we did earlier. Note if I drag too far, the traces begin to collect along the bottom, and we crush the blacks, losing all detail in the shadows. I'll back off until the traces are just touching the zero line. By the same token, dragging left on the top control point along the ceiling raises the highlights, which is analogous to dragging in the master wheel in the gain section of color wheels, dragging that wheel to the right. In this case, we don't really need to do this because we already have good highlight detail that's pretty bright. If we go further, we start blowing out the highlights or clipping them, as we can see both in the waveform and in this area of the image itself. I'll bring that back. You can add control points to this curve by clicking on it. If you add the Shift key before you click, you can be sure to add a control point without moving the curve. I'll add one roughly to the middle of the curve. Dragging this control point up or down is analogous to dragging the master wheel in the gamma section of the color wheels. In other words, I'm adjusting the midtones without affecting the brightest or darkest parts of the image. I'll delete that control point by control-clicking it or right-clicking on it. So far, everything we've done with the curve could be achieved with the master wheels in the color wheels palette. But here's where things get more interesting. I can add control points anywhere along this curve. For example, I'll shift-click to add one close to the shadows and bring that down. Now, before we go further, let me scrub through the clip. As opposed to our earlier clips, which stayed pretty much the same, this has some specific action that changes the overall luminance values. So I'll park my playhead where we can see this additional water spray coming into it. And then I'll adjust that control point. I can add another control point up closer to the highlights and bring up those highlights. So I'm expanding my dynamic range, much like you would if you dragged on the contrast adjustment bar in the color wheels. But I can determine my own pivot point by where I place each of these control points. In other words, what parts of the traces are moving down versus which parts are moving up. And I can continue to add control points to adjust different specific areas of luminance in order to have good tonal range while maintaining detail in both the shadows and the highlights. Let's toggle that correction off and on with Command or Control D. We can see the expanded dynamic range reflected in both the waveform and the histogram overlay, and of course in the image itself. Now that we have a good grounding in how to adjust tonal range with black and white point pickers, with the master wheels in the color wheels palette, and with the Luma curve, in the next lesson, we'll turn our attention to adjusting color balance.